The document that shows where the ceiling sits is published annually by the institution that issued the promise. That is either reassuring or the most important thing you have not yet read. Every monetary system in history was a promise. Not a commodity, not a calculation, not a physical object with intrinsic weight. A promise, issued by an institution, accepted by a population, and sustained entirely by the collective decision to keep accepting it. That is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one. And the history of those promises is not a history of betrayal. It is a history of ceilings, the point at which the gap between what was promised and what could be delivered became too wide to remain invisible. Paris, 1720. A Scottish financier has convinced the French crown to replace gold with paper, backed by the projected wealth of a territory most Frenchmen have never seen. Within 18 months, the paper is worthless and the financier has fled the country in a borrowed coat. Constantinople, 1881. The Ottoman Empire, still militarily powerful, still sovereign, signs a document transferring control of its own tax revenues to a committee of foreign creditors, not through defeat in war, but through the accumulated weight of bond agreements that each looked manageable at the moment of signing. Berlin, 1923. A schoolteacher receives her weekly wages and walks directly to the market because the same amount of paper will not buy the same bread by afternoon. 3 different centuries. 3 different political systems. One mechanism underneath all of them. We are at stage 3 of that mechanism right now, which means the credibility ceiling is not a metaphor. It is a structural condition that appears in every institution that issues obligations across time. Governments, central banks, pension systems, monetary authorities, and it operates through a mechanism that is genuinely simple once you understand what kind of system produces it. It is an incentive distortion system. The gap between what the institution promises and what it can deliver is not a failure of design. It is a consequence of the incentives that govern how promises get made in the first place. Promises are issued during periods of expansion, when the conditions make them feel affordable, when the gap between obligation and capacity is either zero or small enough to treat as theoretical. The conditions that made the promise feel affordable then change. The promise itself does not. Think about a municipal water system that has been on deferred maintenance for 20 years. The pipes look intact from the street. The water still runs at normal pressure. Nobody in the house has any reason to question the infrastructure because the infrastructure is still producing its expected output. But somewhere in a municipal filing cabinet, there is a corrosion assessment report, commissioned once, never updated, technically public, practically unread, that quantifies exactly how far past its design life the system is operating. The ceiling is already in that report. The contact has already been made in the pipes. The only thing missing is the pressure event that forces someone to open the cabinet. That is how the credibility ceiling operates. The gap between the promise and the capacity accumulates in actuarial tables, trustees' reports, budget footnotes, and bond covenant disclosures. Present, accessible, stage 1 is promise expansion. This is the stage that feels like progress, and in many cases it genuinely is. An institution issues obligations that feel structurally affordable because the conditions at the moment of issuance make them manageable. Growth is real. Capacity appears sufficient. Think of a company pension plan designed in 1965 when 10 active workers were contributing for every 1 retiree drawing benefits. The actuarial assumptions were not optimistic. They were accurate for the workforce that existed at the time of the promise. Stage 1 always reflects real conditions. That is not a flaw in the system. That is precisely what makes the ceiling so difficult to see from inside it. Stage 2 is capacity divergence. This is where the conditions that made the promise feel affordable begin changing, while the promise itself remains legally and institutionally fixed. The gap between obligation and capacity starts widening quietly, in the line items that require specialist training to interpret and political will to act upon, neither of which tends to be present simultaneously in the same institution at the same moment. The pension plan from stage 1 now covers the same retirees, but the workforce has contracted. The ratio has shifted from 10-to-1 to 4-to-1. The actuarial table shows the gap. The annual report notes it in language calibrated to acknowledge without alarming. The promise remains unchanged. Stage 3 is ceiling contact. This is where the system makes its first visible contact with the structural limit. Not a collapse, not a formal default, but the moment where financial substitutes appear, where informed observers and official communications begin arriving at different conclusions from the same data. The pension fund extends its assumed rate of return from 6% to 7.5%, not because market conditions support the revision, but because the higher assumption closes enough of the gap to keep the annual report from requiring a crisis disclosure. The water system patches the most visible pipe failure and defers the infrastructure assessment for another fiscal year. The ceiling has been contacted. The system is still running, but the substitutes are now structural, not temporary. Stage 4 is legitimacy negotiation. This is where the institution must renegotiate the terms of its promises, either through formal restructuring, which requires acknowledging the gap explicitly and absorbing the political cost of that acknowledgement, or through informal erosion, which reduces the real value of the obligation through inflation, benefit formula adjustments, or the quiet normalization of repayment terms that were never part of the original promise. The negotiation is not optional. The only remaining question is whether it happens on explicit terms that promise holders can evaluate, or on implicit terms that they absorb without being formally notified. The critical insight is this. Stage 2 is the only stage where the cost of restructuring the promise is lower than the cost of the ceiling contact itself. Every historical case that arrived at Stage 4 in crisis rather than in managed transit. Paris, 1716. The French crown is functionally bankrupt. The wars of Louis XIV have consumed a century of accumulated fiscal capacity. The treasury is empty, and the standard tools of sovereign finance, more taxes, more debt, more austerity, have reached their own ceiling inside a population already pushed to its structural limit. Into this moment arrives John Law, a Scottish financier with a genuinely sophisticated theory of credit money and an audience with the French regent that most economists of the era would have given their careers to secure. Law and Oppos' argument was elegant. Gold is a constraint on economic activity, not a foundation for it. Paper money backed by productive assets, land, trade revenues, the future yields of colonial enterprise, could expand the money supply to match the actual productive capacity of the economy, rather than limiting that capacity to the quantity of metal in the treasury. The regent agreed. Law established the Banque Royale and began issuing paper notes backed by the projected future revenues of the Mississippi Company, a trading enterprise with theoretical rights to the wealth of French Louisiana. This was Stage 1. The promise was the future productivity of a territory most Frenchmen had never seen, administered by a company that had not yet extracted a meaningful revenue from it, denominated in paper issued by a bank whose entire reserve was the credibility of the institution that chartered it. And for approximately 18 months, it worked. Enough people accepted the premise of the promise to make the premise self-reinforcing. Mississippi Company shares rose from 500 livres to 10,000 livres. Paris experienced its first documented traffic congestion as speculators crowded a single street to trade. Ask yourself what that moment looks like from inside an ordinary economic life. You are a Paris merchant in late 1719, holding more paper wealth than your grandfather accumulated across a lifetime of trade. The number is real. The paper is real. The company backing the paper has a charter, a board, and offices in both Paris and New Orleans. The promise feels, from every angle available to you at that moment, like a reasonable thing to trust. Stage 2 arrived the moment Law began issuing notes faster than the underlying asset base could plausibly support. Earlier than the share price peak suggested, later than the underlying revenue figures implied. Informed investors began quietly converting paper to gold and removing both from France. Stage 3 arrived as that conversion accelerated and became visible. Stage 4 arrived in 1720 when the system unwound in a matter of weeks. The share price collapsed to near zero, and Law fled Paris in a carriage borrowed from a sympathetic aristocrat, having arrived as a financial revolutionary and departed as the Ottoman Empire in 1850 was not a failing state. It controlled territory across 3 continents, maintained a professional military, and had recently demonstrated sufficient strategic relevance that Britain and France fought alongside it in the Crimean War to prevent Russian expansion into its territory. What the empire had also done, in financing that war and the modernization programs that followed it, was enter the European bond market for the first time, issuing sovereign debt in London and Paris at rates that reflected genuine investor appetite for emerging market yield. This was stage one. The integration was voluntary, the terms were manageable, and the revenues available to service the debt appeared sufficient given the Empire and Oppos's asset base and the growth assumptions embedded in the bond prospectuses. The promise was issued in good faith by an institution that had every reason, at the moment of issuance, to believe the commitment was within its capacity to keep. Stage 2 arrived through the 1870s as the global financial crisis of 1873 contracted European credit markets and Ottoman export revenues simultaneously. The gap between debt service obligations and available treasury revenues began widening in the fiscal accounts, visible to the finance ministry and to attentive bondholders in London, but not to the broader Ottoman population, which experienced the period as one of continued imperial function rather than structural stress. Stage 3 arrived in 1875, when the Ottoman government suspended interest payments on its external debt. The ceiling had been contacted. The gap between what was promised to bondholders and what the Treasury could deliver was now public, documented, and impossible to defer. Stage 4 arrived 6 years later, in 1881, when the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, not as a temporary arrangement, but as a permanent institution staffed by representatives of the European creditor nations, given direct administrative control over 6 designated streams of Ottoman tax revenue. Consider what that structure means in practice. An Ottoman customs official in the port of Smyrna in 1885 collects import duties from arriving merchant vessels and forwards them, not to the treasury in Constantinople, but to the OPDA office staffed by European administrators, because the bond agreement signed in London in the 1860s legally outranks the fiscal authority of the sovereign government that issued it. The promise made to foreign creditors has become senior to the operational requirements of the state that made it. Sovereignty has not been formally surrendered. It has been functionally transferred through the accumulated weight of obligations that each appeared, at the moment of issuance, to be a manageable commitment within a creditworthy empire and Oppos's capacity to service. The Ottoman Empire did not lose fiscal control through military defeat or political revolution. It transferred that control through a series of bond agreements, each individually defensible, whose aggregate weight produced a stage 4 outcome that no single agreement was designed to create. The distance between the first bond issued and the establishment of the OPDA was approximately 20 years of stage 2 and stage 3 that the Weimar Republic did not create its credibility ceiling. It inherited one, written into the Treaty of Versailles by the victorious powers of the First World War, and was then required to govern a democratic state, while servicing an obligation that the government now responsible for paying it had no role in creating and no realistic mechanism for renegotiating. The reparations figure, eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, was calculated to extract maximum payment from Germany and Oppos's assessed productive capacity, as determined by a commission whose membership consisted entirely of creditor nations. The Weimar government was presented with the obligation and the timeline in 1921, 2 years after signing a peace treaty negotiated by a government that no longer existed. This was stage 2 from the first moment. The gap between the obligation and the capacity was structural before the first payment was due, visible in the German treasury accounts and in the Reparations Commission and Oppos's own working papers, which showed payment projections that required sustained export surpluses. Germany and Oppos's damaged industrial base could not generate at the required pace. Think of receiving a monthly billing statement for a subscription your predecessor signed, sized to their income, due on yours, with no cancellation clause and no appeals process. The promise was not yours. The ceiling was. Stage 3 arrived across 1921 and 1922 as Germany fell progressively behind on its scheduled deliveries of coal and timber, the in-kind reparations payments that substituted for cash when the Treasury lacked foreign exchange. In January 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr industrial region, Germany and Oppos's primary manufacturing and mining area, to extract payment directly from the production source. The German government and Oppos's response was to fund passive resistance among Ruhr workers using printed money, because the alternative was either capitulation to occupation or the complete cessation of government salaries across the country. Stage 4 arrived not as a decision, but as an arithmetic outcome. The government could not formally restructure the reparations obligation, because the creditor nations controlled the restructuring process. It could not honestly service the obligation, because the capacity was not present in the treasury. The remaining path was informal erosion, issuing currency in quantities that reduced the real value of domestic obligations faster than any formal accounting could track. A Berlin schoolteacher in October 1923 receives her wages and walks directly to the nearest market, because she understands from the previous week and Oppos' experience that the same paper will not purchase the same goods by afternoon. She is not experiencing a financial crisis in the conventional sense. She is experiencing the terminal arrival of a stage for that was visible in the Reparations Commission and Oppos' working papers in 1921, visible in the German Treasury accounts in 1922, and visible in the Ruhr occupation in January 1923. Each time, hold the structure for a moment, because what comes next requires the model to be sharp. The credibility ceiling moves through 4 stages. Promise expansion, where the obligation is issued under conditions that make it feel affordable and the gap is either zero or theoretical. Capacity divergence, where the conditions change but the promise does not, and the gap begins accumulating in the annual reports. Ceiling contact, where informed observers and official communications begin arriving at different conclusions from the same data, and the system substitutes financial engineering for genuine capacity. And legitimacy negotiation, where the institution must choose between formal restructuring and informal erosion, and where that choice is almost never made deliberately, because it is almost always made by the structure of the political incentives surrounding the institution rather than by its stated intentions. John Law and Oppos' Paris moved through all 4 stages in under 2 years. The Ottoman Empire took 3 decades, through a sequence of individually defensible bond agreements whose aggregate weight produced an outcome no single agreement was designed to create. Weimar Germany inherited its ceiling pre-constructed from a peace treaty negotiated by a government that no longer existed, and arrived at stage 4 through the only path the architecture left available. Here is the question the second half of this documentary is built around. The United States has spent 80 years as one of the primary creditors in this mechanism. The institution on the Stage 1, promise expansion, is a completed chapter for the American fiscal architecture, not a current condition. The entitlement programs built between 1935 and the early 1970s, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, were issued during a demographic and economic expansion that made the actuarial assumptions embedded in them feel, at the time of passage, not optimistic, but conservative. The workforce-to-beneficiary ratios that underpinned those promises reflected a population structure that was real when the commitments were made, and that no longer exists in the form the commitments assumed. Stage 2, capacity divergence, is documented annually in a report that almost no American has read, and that almost every American in Oppos' financial future depends upon. The Social Security and Medicare trustees publish an annual report that shows, with actuarial precision, the projected gap between trust fund revenues and promised benefit obligations across the next 75 years. The gap is not new. It has been present in those reports for over 2 decades, growing gradually, described each year in language that acknowledges the trajectory while maintaining the framing of manageability. This is exactly what Stage 2 looks like from inside a system that has contacted its ceiling in the actuarial record, but not yet in the political conversation. Stage 3, ceiling contact, has a present-day indicator that is no longer a projection. Net interest payments on the federal debt have now exceeded the annual defense budget, not as a future scenario in a congressional budget office outlook, but as a current line item in the federal budget. The substitutions that characterize Stage 3 are already active and already normalized. Debt ceiling suspensions treated as routine legislative procedure, extraordinary measures used so regularly they have become ordinary ones, continuing resolutions substituting for annual budgets across fiscal years where the gap between revenue and obligation has made a formal budget politically unpassable. The ceiling has been contacted. The system is still running. But what is holding it at stage 3 is not structural capacity. It is institutional momentum and the absence, so far, of a pressure event large enough to force the cabinet open. Consider what that means for an ordinary American household trying to make long-term planning decisions. You are not a bond trader or a fiscal policy analyst. You are trying to determine whether the Social Security benefit in your retirement projection is a reasonable planning assumption or an optimistic one. The answer to that question is in the trustee's report, in the actuarial tables, in the budget footnotes, accessible to anyone, read by almost no one, and structurally more informative than any official summary of what those pages contain. Stage 4, legitimacy negotiation, has not formally arrived, but its early vocabulary is already present in the policy discussions surrounding the programs carrying the largest obligations. Means testing proposals, benefit formula adjustment conversations, inflation measurement methodology debates, interest rates held near or below the inflation rate. None of these are crisis signals in themselves. They are the nascent vocabulary of a stage 4 negotiation that has not yet been formally acknowledged as such, because the political cost of that acknowledgement has not yet been exceeded by the political cost of continuing to defer it. That distance, between stage 3 and stage 4, is the most important variable the credibility ceiling model identifies. And it is a distance whose accurate measurement requires the annual report, not the press release. The first question a stage model generates is always the same. When does the system move from one stage to the next? It is the right question. The historical record gives a precise answer, not a date, but a description of the mechanism, which is more useful than a date because it is visible in the current indicators rather than projected from the official forecasts. The transition from stage 3 to stage 4 is not triggered by a single event. It is triggered by a threshold, the point at which the cost of maintaining the stage 3 position exceeds the cost of formally acknowledging the gap it has been designed to manage. 3 structural mechanisms have historically driven that threshold crossing, appearing across the French, Ottoman, and German cases in different combinations, but with consistent underlying logic. The first is demographic arithmetic. The workforce-to-beneficiary ratio in the American entitlement architecture has been moving in one direction for 4 decades, driven by a birth rate that declined after the baby boom and a life expectancy that extended beyond the actuarial assumptions embedded in the original program design. This is the slowest moving transition trigger in the historical record, which is precisely why it tends to be addressed last. Its visibility is high, its urgency feels low, and it crosses its critical threshold at a point that is legible in the actuarial tables well before it is legible in the political conversation. The second is refinancing pressure cascade. Short-term government debt rolled at significantly higher rates than the rates at which it was originally issued creates a compounding budget stress that forces the entitlement gap into direct competition with discretionary spending in the same annual negotiation. The moment those 2 obligation streams are competing for the same shrinking fiscal space is the moment the stage 3 position becomes visibly insufficient as a long-term management strategy. This trigger moves faster than demographic arithmetic and is already partially visible in the current interest payment trajectory. The third is credibility compression among promise holders. The population that holds the promises, current and future Social Security recipients, Medicare beneficiaries, holders of Treasury instruments, begins adjusting its behavior based on a private assessment that stage 4 restructuring is more probable than full promise fulfillment. When that assessment moves from surveys into behavior, appearing in savings rates, retirement timing decisions, and the portfolio choices of institutional investors, the transition accelerates in ways that are difficult to reverse through official communication alone. These 3 mechanisms do not need to arrive simultaneously to produce the threshold crossing. In the historical cases examined, the trigger was typically the interaction of 2 of the 3. A structural arithmetic problem whose urgency had been deferred, combined with a confidence shift that made the deferral mechanism visible to enough participants to change their behavior. The mechanism is already running. What is not yet determined is the sequence and the speed. Understanding the credibility ceiling model does not automatically produce a useful response to it. A structural model can generate its own form of paralysis when the gap between the scale of the system and the scale of any individual and Oppos's position inside it becomes the dominant feeling. So this section is not about predictions or prescriptions. It is about the three orientations available to anyone who has followed the model to this point. The first orientation is continuation on the basis of the official summary. Accept the annual trustees report headline rather than the trustees report itself. Treat the stage 3 substitutions currently maintaining the system as permanent features rather than as temporary structural bridges. Plan retirement income, healthcare costs, and long-term financial commitments on the assumption that the promise as originally stated will be delivered as originally stated. This is the most statistically common orientation inside any stage 3 environment, and the system is designed to accommodate it, because the system requires participants who continue to act on the basis of the original promise in order to sustain the conditions that keep the stage 3 position viable. There is nothing irrational about this orientation. It is a reasonable response to a system that is still producing its expected outputs. The question it leaves open is whether the official summary and the annual report are telling the same story. The second orientation is reactive repositioning based on stage 4 anticipation. Treat the ceiling contact at stage 3 as equivalent to stage 4 arrival. Reposition entirely on the basis of worst-case restructuring scenarios. Interpret every budget headline as confirmation of imminent formal default or inflationary erosion. This orientation misreads the timeline and typically incurs transition costs that patient positioning avoids, because the distance between stage 3 and stage 4 is genuinely uncertain in duration, and acting as though that distance is zero imposes real costs in exchange for protection against a scenario whose timing is not readable from the available indicators. The third orientation is structural literacy applied to long-term planning. Read the annual report rather than the summary. Understand where the ceiling sits relative to current obligation levels, not to predict the stage 4 mechanism, but to construct planning assumptions that account for the range of stage 4 outcomes the historical record makes plausible: formal restructuring, informal erosion through inflation, benefit formula adjustment, or some combination. Make decisions that expand the range of available responses to that range of outcomes, rather than optimizing exclusively for the scenario in which the original promise is delivered exactly as stated. The actuary who read the workforce ratio when it first appeared in the 1987 annual John Law and Oppos's Mississippi system, the Ottoman Treasury and Oppos's bond architecture, the Weimar reparations obligation, each was described by the institutions managing it, in real time, as a temporary difficulty within a manageable framework. The French regent and Oppos's advisors described the paper money expansion as a controlled stimulus. The Ottoman finance ministry described each bond issuance as a bridge to fiscal stabilization. The Weimar government described the reparations schedule as a challenging but survivable commitment. None of those descriptions were dishonest in the crude sense. They were accurate assessments of the official position, made by people whose institutional role was to manage the system rather than to evaluate whether the system and Oppos's structural foundations remained intact beneath the management. The credibility ceiling does not require bad intentions. It does not require a designed extraction or a deliberate deception. It requires only that the institutions issuing promises face stronger incentives to expand those promises during favorable conditions than they face constraints that force honest accounting of the gap when conditions change. That asymmetry is structural. It appears in democratic governments and authoritarian ones, in currency systems and pension systems and sovereign bond markets, across 3 centuries of documented cases that all arrived at the same 4-stage destination through different entry points and different speeds. 4 stages. 1 direction. Promise expansion, capacity divergence, ceiling contact, legitimacy negotiation. We are at stage 3. The ceiling has been contacted. The stage 3 position is being maintained through substitutions that are now structural rather than temporary. The annual reports that show the distance between the current position and stage 4 are published by the institutions carrying the largest obligations, updated each year, written in language that rewards careful reading with a more accurate picture of the current situation than any official summary provides. The system does not care whether you believe in it. It ran through John Law and Oppos's Paris whether or not the investors read the Mississippi Company and Oppos' revenue figures. It ran through the Ottoman treasury whether or not the bondholders examined the Empire and Oppos' fiscal accounts. It runs at the pace the arithmetic sets, indifferent to the beliefs and the planning assumptions of the people whose financial futures are most shaped by where the ceiling sits. Think of a homeowner who has lived in the same house for 20 years, who receives the municipality and Oppos' annual water quality report every spring, sets it on the kitchen table, and moves it to the recycling bin 3 days later without opening it. Not because the information is unavailable, not because the report is written in inaccessible language, but because the tap still runs and the pressure still feels normal and the immediate demands of a Tuesday morning are more present than the infrastructure data of a filing cabinet in a municipal building across town. The ceiling ISN and Oppos' visible until you and Oppos' already pressing against it. And by then, the room has been getting smaller for years. What changes between now and the moment the stage 3 position becomes publicly unsustainable is not the mechanism. The mechanism is already running. What changes is the quality of the decisions made by people who read the annual report before it became the retrospective explanation for what followed, versus the people who